A very interesting part of our Georgia Salzburger heritage is the fact that a lot of folks still have the heritage last names, and I find that so interesting. My grandma's maiden name was Seconder, and so she was married in 1941, excuse me, and so that heritage last name stopped years ago in my immediate family. The same thing for my husband. That's not the case for the fellow that's sitting here with me today, Tom Grovenstein. So Tom, will you tell us a little bit about your background, your childhood, because you didn't grow up in Effingham. So tell us a little bit about that, and also when you knew of your Georgia Salzburger heritage.
It was very interesting that even though I didn't grow up in Effingham County was a very big part of my life when I was young, and even today. We were in Bibb County, which is in middle Georgia, Macon, Georgia. And my grandfather lived in Guyton in Effingham County. So when I was a little kid, we came down here 2 or 3 times a year to visit my grandfather, who was a Grovenstein, Angus Grovenstein. And so I just was introduced from the time I was a little kid, even though I would not have known it was genealogy. I just knew that we had an important name. And we had a cemetery to come visit, and so as a little kid, it was just very, very intriguing to me that there were historical things that had to do with the Grovenstein name. And as I got older and I started to understand what that meant, then I started asking questions that meant something. But we would come down, and when we were in Guyton visiting my grandfather, we would always go to the Guyton Cemetery, which is where my great-grandparents are buried and where my grandfather is buried. We would also come here to the Jerusalem Cemetery, and we have Grovensteins buried here, and we have some idea that there are some Grovensteins buried here that are not marked because some of the original marks are gone. And we'll never know for sure exactly who was buried where and what have you. But as I got older and started asking more questions, I started getting very interested in the genealogy that is part of my life and part of every person's life. Everybody has a genealogical background, no matter where you're from. There's a history to who you are. And so when I started coming down here, as I said, when I was young, I didn't really know what to ask, but I just knew it was something important. And as I got older, I started realizing more and more what that importance was and what it is today.
So your last name being Grovenstein still, we can trace that back to the very beginning of Georgia, to the trustees' colony, basically, of Georgia before it becomes the crown colony that it was. And so we have so much information about Grovenstein, but then your patriarch of your family in Georgia, we know just a very little bit about. And so I'm a Grovenstein descendant that we just looked in the old Red Book to see that. And that's one thing we can't find, we haven't been able to find. And so can you talk, you mentioned that about your dad, so can you talk about that? It's going to be very important to find those details about Justus, but we just don't know. So can you elaborate on that, your time of trying to research him?
Sure. Well, what has happened is that the farther back in time you go, no matter what, the vaguer things are, the more vague information is out there. Well, Johann Justus Grabenstein, which is, we think, kind of how it's pronounced, he is my 7th great-grandfather. And we think he came over about 1758, 1758, 1759, something like that. We don't know exactly. And he starts showing up in the records around 1761, 1762, and then we see him more. But the problem is we don't know where he came from. We assume because we're Salzburgers that he came from Salzburg, but we don't know that. We don't know whether he came from the northern part of what was then the colonies, Pennsylvania. We just don't know. And we have been looking, my father, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, was asking the same question. And as you know, because I've asked you for your help quite a few times, we're still looking. So one of the important things about what we do here is we look for the little small things that are not always easy to find. And like I say, one of these days, I hope I'll find that answer. And it'll be a big deal for me to find out, where he came from.
Oh, yes. I think I'll holler whenever we find that one. I'll be so glad. I know that we've mentioned in the past that birth and death and marriage records, we think of those as being primary sources, of those are what gets our focus. But the right back here behind us, Mary Bondurant Warren's transcripts of the Georgia Governor and Council journals, that was very helpful to me to find, I think, the first instance of his arrival in Georgia. It's the 1764 land request that he has, saying he has a wife because he had just gotten married, and that he'd been in the province for about 4 years. So that's 1759 to 1760. But that is all. We just don't know. And so unfortunately that's the case for some of our folks. Now, you mentioned coming to Jerusalem as a young fellow, which would be in the 60s as a child. And my memories begin, 20 years later, but I remember the wooden markers at the front of the cemetery. So can you talk maybe about some of your specifics about your memories of coming to Jerusalem?
Well, when the Jerusalem cemetery of my youth was visited, there was not this big fence that surrounded it now and everything. It was much more open to the public. You could just walk in. And well, you can still walk in now, but you have to go through a gate.
Yes.
Back then, there was just an open area with a cemetery. And in the front corner of the cemetery were old wooden grave markers. They weren't able to be read. There was no names on them. They were just basically old wooden boards that were very well worn. And those have disappeared. Don't know why they disappeared, because they disappeared slowly. They didn't all go at one time. It rotted away. I don't know if they were stolen. I just don't know, because they just disappeared a little bit at a time. And so now we don't even have those wooden markers, unless there may be, if we look, there may be some little piece here and there, but I don't think there is. So that's, it's a shame that we've lost that, but that's part of, the times. They just, as time goes, things that are old disappear. And that's also true of other cemeteries. There's a cemetery down in St. Mary's, Georgia, where I have some of my long-lost genealogical kinfolk, and they have the same situation where they were old wooden markers that are no longer available. In fact, they have some of them in a museum that have been moved. Oh. They're actually just been removed so that they wouldn't disappear. But again, there's no marks on them. They're just old cemetery markers with no names or anything on them. So, it's just part of what we do looking for the genealogical record, is we try to find the best that we can and hope for the best. And but that's what they had to make markers with. They didn't have granite stone then, they had wood. There's plenty of that.
Oh,
and so they had plenty of it.
Certainly. So you mentioned as a child also coming to Guyton and some of your memories of your granddad. So I think that's very interesting for those older memories of Guyton. So can you elaborate on those?
Well, my granddaddy was named Angus Shadrach Grovenstein. And he was a little short fella. I was about 5'7" or 5'8". But even when but right before he died, when he was in his late 70s, he was so strong. He was a blacksmith for the Southern Railroad, and he could. I remember this, and like I said, I wasn't that old when he died. I was 11, I think, but I remember that he could do a one-arm pull-up out on a monkey bar that he had out in his yard, over in Guyton.
Whoa.
And this was when, I mean, I can't do that now. So, but he could do a one-arm pull-up when he was in his 70s. But he was no more interested in lineage than anybody. He didn't, you know, I think one of the things he said one time is, I don't care about my any of my relatives, they're all dead now. It's like, well, yeah, that's why we want to know about them. But he just didn't care. That was not his, he was not a particularly well-educated man. He worked in a time when, you know, through the Depression, he worked, you know, building railroads, building trains. And that's what he did. But Guyton back then, it's always been a small, very small town. But I remember when the railroad ran through Guyton. There used to be a railroad track that ran right through Guyton. And my great-grandfather, Angus Nesbitt Grovenstein, was the paymaster for that railroad back in the turn of the century, in the early 1900s. So he died in 1932, I think. So, but he was the paymaster. So that we've had quite a bit to do with the railroads,
Yes.
you know, for a long time. But yeah, it's hard to imagine saying that Guyton is all grown up now because it's still very small. But compared to what it used to be, it's really all grown up now.
So you mentioned earlier, whenever we were talking before we started filming, about the Grovenstein property off of 17 going towards Scriven County. So would you talk about that?
Certainly. There is a piece of property on State Highway 17 going out towards Scriven County. And we knew it as the old Grovenstein place. My great-grandfather, Angus Nesbitt Grovenstein, lived on that property. And even though he was long dead when I came along, I do remember visiting that house, and there were Grovensteins still living in it then. And we would visit it. It actually was used during the Civil War as a training area. And they've just put up in the last 10 years one of these historical markers that talks about that it was used as a training area for the Confederates. And I think that there were a couple of 100 acres that he owned. In fact, the back corner of that old Grovenstein property is where my grandfather, Angus Shadrach, owned his house. So he was still on a corner of the old property. And I'm sure if we went back and looked at a lot of the old records, that we would find a lot of tie-ins. In fact, that may be something I can do soon, is just start working on and putting all the tie-ins together with land ownership. But it was, my great-grandfather was, I guess, he was a very important person for the little town of Guyton. He was a state representative. So, you know, he was a big deal in a small town, big fish in a small you know, town. So, but yes, it's nice to be able to look back and see, you know, how your family made a difference. And so, but Guyton, it's an interesting little town.
Oh, certainly. So you have said before that, talking about asking questions of old folks, that you didn't know you need to start asking questions until those folks were already deceased and it was too late for you to start. So what would be your words for young folks along that line?
Well, there's a couple of things. First, young people, if they're anything like me, don't know that they're going to be interested when they get older, but they are. Young people don't really, most young people that I know don't care at all about who their great-grandparents or anything like that. They just don't care. It's not something that's in their DNA to care right now. But as they get to a certain age, I was in my 40s when I really started being interested. My father kind of always I grew up with him always teaching me about our lineage, but it wasn't until I was in my 40s that I really got interested. And by then it was just too late. I didn't have anybody to ask except my father, and he knew some, but he didn't know everything. And but what I would suggest is that young people, and I'm talking about 40 on down, I mean young people, if you will come up with a list of questions, 10 questions, and go to those people in your family who are older, especially, aunts and uncles and grandparents, things of that nature, and sit down and ask them these questions. If you can tape it, that'd be the best. That way you have a verbal record, an oral record. But at the least, have give them some questions and ask them to fill out kind of fill out what they remember, and it will be so valuable to you when you get older to be able to look back and say, well, what did they think about whatever, and you'll just be so glad that you did that.
I think that is so it's so important. My grandma, she lived to be in her late 90s. Well, she could tell me stories that her mama told her that she knew from, her childhood and her experiences. So it's important to write that stuff down if you can't film it. It's priceless if you can film it, but it's important to write it down so that whenever you're older, you'll have it and can remember it. Now, one thing that we wanted to talk about is in your fall 2023 GSS newsletter article, you mentioned the interviews that, like what we're doing right now. We have the YouTube channel just for this. And can you maybe explain a little bit more? I know that I had a couple of two folks in their 90s, hallelujah, ask me about doing this at Landing Day just a few weeks ago. And can you talk more about maybe explaining what we're going to be trying to do with these interviews?
Absolutely. What we're going to try to do is, we're not going to try to do it, we're going to do this. We're going to ask everybody out there. So if you're hearing this, I'm talking to you. We want you to at least do a written record, but we hope to get an audio record and even a film record so that we can put this on this YouTube channel. It'll be something that'll be valuable from now on, because there are people that come into this library regularly who ask questions about people who are deceased. And if we had records of these people, questions that were answered, and in the next article, I'm actually going to put out a kind of a primer explaining the questions that are most important to answer, and so that you'll have like a guideline to go by, so that you can sit down with the people that are important in your lives, that you can, come up with a historical evidence of what happened in their lives. Things are always changing in history. So the things that happened in the 40s and in the 50s and in the 60s, if you're young, you don't have a clue except what you see on TV. But as far as the real, nitty gritty, we have to have it. We have to have it documented. And so what we want to do is to have people do these documentaries, and not only for yourselves, but also to present them to the Georgia Salzburger Society so that we can have them as a record in perpetuity, forever. So that's what we're going to work on, and if you'll look forward to the next newsletter, I will have an article in there that kind of lays out a formula to do this.
Okay. And that newsletter you're referring to is the spring 2024 one that's going to come out sometime about the middle of May, and so you'll have the specifics in there. So whenever you talk about older folks, like these two cousins that talked to me at Landing Day, they're both 91, 92 years old, and they have, they're sharp as a couple of tacks, still, and so they've got some stories to be able to tell. Well, they talked to me about what do you want, and really what's important to you. They have a granddaddy that lived to be 106 years old and died in the 70s, before I was born, but they have good memories of him, and he was one that could tell a story. He was always in the media, always on TV, I guess especially when he hit 100, but those are valuable. They remember him, even though he's been dead for 50 years, they remember those, and his stories date back to right after the American Civil War. So it's endless potential, and I'm so glad that we're getting to do this. And that's why this YouTube channel has been created. So I wanted to thank you very much for, sitting here with me today. I appreciate this. So anything further you want to mention in closing?
Well, just this. what we think may be important is, but there are a lot of things out there that we might not think that are important that are. And it is so vitally important that the younger generation utilize the unbelievable knowledge, the stories, the information that these older folks have. And we need to get them before it's too late, because once it's too late, it's gone forever.
Yes, exactly. Very well said. Thank you so much.